Hey, what's up guys? Gons here with this week's word of encouragement. It comes from Daniel 1, verses 8 and 9. Here's what it says. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Now, first off, this word defile here has this idea of pollution or polluting one's self. Daniel basically requested that he not pollute himself. And remember, this was when he was in captivity in Babylon. And so this idea is not just physically, but very much spiritually. Some of the commentaries of this passage and just Daniel in general suggests that the reason why he rejected the king's food was because a lot of that food was being sacrificed and offered to idols and other gods. And so the idea here is that Daniel was faithful to the Lord in spite of all of the freely offered food of the kings. But it also stems right back to Genesis 3 and the forbidden fruit and Daniel rejecting instead of accepting the lie in this case. In more ways than one, we can relate to Daniel here because he's living in this pagan nation, and what we're seeing right now today, some 2,500 years after Daniel lived in Babylon, we're seeing the same thing, except this system that's closing in is not just in the United States or in Europe or whatever, it's global. There is this global order that is taking form right before our eyes. So I think Daniel is a great example, a protocol of how we ought to operate within that system and stay faithful to the Lord. And while Daniel was trained and educated in the Babylonian system, he knew his God, and he didn't compromise his faith and his knowledge of him. And again, it says here that nor did he drink the wine. And God doesn't forbid you from drinking wine, but nevertheless, in this situation, in this pagan culture, most wine and meat was dedicated to gods. And so that's why Daniel refused it. When it says, therefore he requested, he's really directly going against the king here. This, in many ways, is almost punishable by death in certain situations in that time. But I think we can relate it today to standing up to some of the things that seem to be PC. And what I mean by that is politically correct. There are certain things that culturally are emerging now that make it seem like those who hold on to the faith in Jesus Christ are more and more marginalized and sound crazy and outside the realms of what is politically correct. But Daniel doesn't compromise here, and we ought not to either. And the most important part here is the beginning of the passage where it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart. In order to conquer the difficult trials and things that are in front of us that we face, we have to purpose in our heart beforehand, before any of the stuff we face is set before us. Otherwise, we would be more susceptible to compromise. And this is a great example of Daniel's protest being courteous. Again, Daniel requested. He made a polite request showing discretion. And this is really important because in this day and age, making a stand for Jesus Christ is not for us to be obnoxious and to annoy people and to shove the Bible down their throats or anything like that. There is a level of respect that Daniel showed the Babylonian system and the kings of the Babylonian court. And so in return, Daniel was respected as his own. And this is really important for today's society, especially where respect is still a big deal. So as a result of Daniel's character and the way he carried himself in the situation, it says in verse 9 that God gave Daniel favor and goodwill with the authorities. God had brought Daniel into the favor. God will never abandon us when we stand for him. Daniel basically entrusted himself to God, and God pretty much came through. And in fact, in this case, God moved upon the authorities so they will regard Daniel with goodwill. And God worked through the wise actions of Daniel to cultivate this goodwill. And we see the rest of the story with Daniel. He sees visions, he has favor with God, but he also has power and authority in the Babylonian system. He's highly respected. And so the hope here and the encouragement here that you can draw from this is how we carry ourselves in the world that is increasingly growing dark, that is hostile towards the gospel, and just culturally different. It's so easy, and I'm even guilty of this, of going around just going, expose this, and that's evil and all this stuff. And yes, that is important. But in terms of dealing with the people themselves in that system, especially the authorities, the kings of Babylon, there's a way in which you can operate and Daniel exemplifies it perfectly. And ultimately, because of Daniel's faithfulness to God, God moved in the hearts of the kings of Babylon to have goodwill and favor towards Daniel. And we can see the same thing here. We're not meant to just sit here and suffer. We're actually meant to make a difference, to be salt and light. So let this be a lesson and encouragement to draw from Daniel. And I encourage you to read the book of Daniel in general, because there's a lot in there, both prophetically, but also supernaturally, and also just in this life lesson here of how we ought to operate in a pagan society, in a pagan world, in an anti-Christ system that's being built all around us. So again, I'm going to read this passage, but try to put your own name in place of Daniel here. Verse 8, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." Verse 9, "Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs." Hope you have an awesome week. God bless.